Theo, how you going, mate?
I'm very well, thank you. I'm very well. How are you?
I am fantastic. So you're joining me over from the UK somewhere?
I am indeed, hence why it's a little bit dark. I'm also in our kind of music room, hence
Yeah,
for a good microphone. So I'm in Bristol in the UK. So I'm sorry if I'm a
Bristol.
bit murky.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's fine, mate. Are you a Bristol Rovers supporter or?
I must admit I'm not a Bristol native. So Bristol Flyers basketball team is my main one that we
Right,
follow.
right. Do you play
Um,
basketball yourself?
well, I did up until everyone hit puberty and everyone else grew and I didn't. So I realized
Hey,
it was time for a sport change.
that
But
that 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 story resonates with me very well. I was the under 14s MVP in my local league, and then I stayed 5'8" for the rest of my life. So
yeah, exactly. I played high level up until about 14 and then pivoted.
love
And
it.
you're in Melbourne, right?
Yeah, I'm in Melbourne, mate. Born
Uh
and born and bred in Melbourne. Family's from Macedonia, though, over in Eastern Europe. So, been out there a few times as well. So, yeah, have you been
oh
out here
nice.
before?
I haven't. One of my best friends from home lives in Melbourne actually.
Right.
His mum's Australian, he moved out for uni and never left, says it's amazing. So maybe one day I can make it out and see it. But I've heard great things.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I mean, it's a fantastic city. When we're not locked down for 365 days, it's a fantastic city to live in, mate. So look, let's keep things rolling. I'm enjoying the conversation thus far. Theo, you're the head of the Life Itself Labs, and you're the project lead there. What can you tell me about Life Itself? What is Life Itself?
So life itself is an interesting mix of things, really. So the larger organization is particularly looking at how we can foster cultural change. So fundamentally looking at the cultural and kind of inner capacities, which we're going to need to bring about kind of like a broader social transition. So what are the kind of emotional, psychological and spiritual capabilities fundamentally? That are going to be necessary for us to address the problems that we're facing today. I kind of work in a Life Itself Labs, a subsidiary of that, which is particularly looking at the more kind of systems level stuff. So the
Mm-hmm.
intersection, particularly of alternative economics, governance, and technology, and looking at how all of these can factor into, again, kind of a transition in the way we organize our society, which I think many of us will agree is vitally needed.
Absolutely, absolutely is. And speaking of that intersection between culture, society, and technology, I think Web3, crypto, Bitcoin, the broader sort of decentralized world definitely falls into that bucket. And Life Itself has recently published a Web3 and crypto guide. Basically, it was a multi-month project of research and analysis to make sense of crypto. What can you tell us about this research and how it all came about?
Oh, well, yeah. Many months of my blood, sweat, and tears is my first description. Yeah, I think it was just a really fascinating thing for us because the social change kind of ecosystem that we found ourselves in is incredibly excited by these
Mm-hmm.
technologies. And I must admit, sort of before joining and embarking on this, I hadn't heard much about it. I kind of knew what Bitcoin was, but that was back in the day when, all you heard was it was used to buy drugs on the internet, and that was
Yeah.
kind of the extent of it. And sort of all of a sudden people are shouting about DAOs and kind of like the revolutionary potential of this technology and how it's going to be a huge role in transforming how we live. And kind of sort of myself and my colleague Rufus, particularly, who I collaborated a lot on this work with, we're both kind of social scientists by background. He was
Mm-hmm.
an economics professor formerly, and kind of we were just really intrigued by this, and so we kind of started poking and picking at it and doing our own research as to what was going on with these projects, and just really seeking to understand, okay, well, there's some really quite big claims being made here, and a lot of people that, smart people that we respect a lot and have really aligned value with, that are extolling this as the way that we need to be focusing all our energies if we're going to kind of bring about the social change that we want. So, I'm in the interests of rigor and kind of the guarding against opportunity cost, we wanted to really kind of dig into what's the underlying, particularly social science of this, because often we kind of hear the technical language being flown around, but what does this actually look like social scientifically? And there wasn't much of
Mm-hmm.
that about. so that we can hopefully contribute to a constructive debate of where those of us that care about changing society should put our efforts. And this guide, which contains kind of loads of analysis of what we found to be sort of the core and kind of often biggest claims that are made about Web3 tech and blockchain technology, particularly sort of geared towards social change, was the result of that.
Fantastic. And the guide itself, I mean, there are about a dozen or so claims that you guys look at. I think we'll touch on maybe 5 today. So some of these claims are that 1, Bitcoin will and should become the new gold standard. 2, crypto will provide better payment and remittance services. 3, crypto can help solve the public goods problem. 4, Web3 can help revolutionize cooperation. And 5, crypto can provide better means of financializing non-financial value. And to give you a little bit of backstory on me, for the past 6 years, I've been in and out of crypto in various forms, spun off a decentralized property ownership platform back in 2018, ran a Web3 accelerator. However, at the same time, I've been running a Web2 startup accelerator for about 8 years. We've incubated about 100 companies. And to me, what matters most really at the end of the day is, are we solving a problem for customers? That is the number one thing. And number 2 then becomes, well, can we make more money selling it than it takes to actually put it out into the market? Can it be profitable? And these are 2 things that venture capitalists look at as well. And I'm capable of arguing both for and against crypto. But today what I'll do, I'll try to play the role of the pro crypto kid with the Doodles t-shirt on, who's done all his research and he's read the Bitcoin white paper and he's done all that stuff. He's gone down the rabbit holes. And you'll obviously play the role of the person who's arguing, perhaps to some degree, against, because many of the findings that have come out in your report are that these claims being made by the broader crypto sphere are indeed false. How does that sound, Theo?
That sounds great. I mean, I'd recommend we start with public goods and financializing value. I think that's where most of the fun stuff is, in my opinion, but I'll take your lead. And just to preface that before going, like, I think to really emphasize that while we have come out and said that actually there's a lot of reason to be skeptical about kind of the underlying mechanisms of these claims, I am really, really keen to contribute to generative debate. And I love the aspiration behind a lot of what's going on in Web3. And actually, I think it's one of the areas where there is the most fertile ground for some really interesting experimentation with new ways of doing things, which is getting people excited that otherwise wouldn't. And actually, you know, if your route into kind of cooperative ownership and decentralized governance is through a DAO, then I'm agnostic. I don't mind that at all. But I think it's just really important that we get to grips with, okay, well, how are these claims supposed to be working? And let's have a realistic perception of them. So by no means a crypto hater, but that should absolutely sounds like a good way to have a good discussion.
No, I think that's a good preface. And ultimately, I think perhaps we can also just be an example for something that seems to be lacking in social, in discourse today in society, which is we can actually have a constructive conversation, argue for and against in a way that hopefully we both learn something from and help to refine our own worldview for the better, as opposed to just trying to argue an argument in order to be quote unquote right.
Exactly. This is a making sense project for a reason. Like, if I'm proven wrong coming out of this, then that for me is a resounding success.
Fantastic. I like that attitude. So let's take your lead on the first claim. So crypto can provide better means of financializing non-financial value. So I guess for our audience, how do you define non-financial value, and what did you find in this space? Is this claim true or false, and why?
Great. Yeah. So non-financial value is broadly just all of the stuff that isn't money. So all the things that we think we care about, that's not the money that we have in our bank accounts, be it kind of like, the value of a beautiful painting, or even like a flourishing art sector overall, most obviously a climate that's not full of, degrading around us, and kind of biodiversity and all of these kind of things, which we think have in some sense valuable, but which aren't really, aren't captured by gold coins or numbers in a bank account. And by financializing here, it's not just a matter of kind of extending the financial system, which is the traditional definition, but capturing those in some kind of like monetary, or as the case may be, token form, which can then be allocated in the hope of boosting them. So I think I largely found, I can say as the lead on this, that there's a lot of reason to be skeptical about this. at least from my understanding of the social science and the political economy particularly, which is an area of my own sort of focus. So we looked at three strands. I mean, the first is public goods funding, which is a big one, but we gave that its own analysis because it's sufficiently big. So I'll bracket that here, and maybe we can leap to it. The two big fora that we hear about this claim that Web3 can financialize value is NFTs and then also alternative currencies. So you hear the claims made a lot that, you know, NFTs are going to empower artists and finally kind of revolutionize this really unfair art sector that's kind of concentrating money in the hands of people and leaving sort of penniless artists, and the NFTs are going to be the way out of this to a more egalitarian art sector. And similarly, a lot of alternative currency projects floating around that are advocating that if only we can come up with new blockchain-based ways of representing value, that we can really unlock and sort of divert resources to all of these neglected areas that I've reeled off at the start there, and actually support them in ways that our current financial system just doesn't do. So I can go to each of those in turn as you like.
Yeah, I mean, if we look at, say, 2020, 2021, that was really the, it was DeFi summer / the rise of NFTs, particularly with so many people sitting at home collecting their stimulus checks and having nowhere to spend it. But on the internet, and we did see, you know, millions and millions poured into doodles and, you know, Bored Apes and you name it. There was all sorts of stuff going on, but more so that, you know, that's the PFP stuff, which is really like trading cards effectively. And then we saw the evolution of, well, you can use this NFT. Say I'm a musician, you can buy my NFT and then you can get access to, say, exclusive tracks. You can get access to my private Discord channel. You get free merch, all this sort of stuff. It's another avenue for a particular, say, artist, be they a musician, be they a painter, whatever the case is, to help monetize their craft. Because as we know, you know, the Pareto principle definitely holds true in the world of the creative arts, where the top 1% of authors, musicians, artists, you name it, generate 90 to 95% of the income, and everybody else is more or less, quote unquote, a starving musician. So the finding on this use case for NFTs, Theo, ultimately came out to be largely false, according to the guide. And why is that? Why did you come to that conclusion?
There's a couple of things here, but even going one step further, I want to kind of make one of the reasons why or sort of back, should I say, that we found this to be false, which I think is important to emphasize in all of these cases. And firstly, in that I think we should be skeptical of the idea that more financialization is really what we need to solve the problems that we face in these sectors, right? So kind of basically, markets are one way of allocating our resources, and they work really well in some cases, but in many areas they don't. And I think there are a number of reasons that we might be skeptical that the financialization and thus kind of like marketization is not really what we want in the arts or in other areas of value. So, I mean, again, I don't want to go off the deep end into the philosophy of value. You know, my aesthetics days are long since behind me, but kind of there's perhaps something here around losing the essence of what makes something valuable when we try and reduce it down to this way, to this kind of financial value. So I think that's something to keep in the back of our minds, but hands up, that kind of depends on the wacky.
Yeah, I guess that's more of a philosophical position, though.
Yeah,
some
exactly.
people out there who are struggling to put food on the table, as a musician, might say, well, I'd like to financialize the value I'm creating.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think there's a couple of other things here. I mean, firstly, marketization, I think, is something, and again, you know, the idea of a market society is raised by a guy, Carl Polanyi, in a great book, The Great Transformation, which I recommend everybody reads. That basically the mentalities, relations, and incentives of the market basically dominate all facets of our lives. And this is kind of, you know, can end up in quite a dystopian world. And similarly, we might just say there are opportunity costs, that actually the best way for artists to put the food on the table is not through kind of generating better art markets. So again, I wouldn't want to say that it's the case of, oh, you must be an artistic purist and do this for free, or you know, we have way more marketization of everything. There are other ways, such as public goods funding, when, you know, like, you know, more centralized funding mechanisms and so on, arts funds and grants, which I can speak to. But to now hone in a little bit on NFTs particularly. So I think some of the issues that we kind of found, basically NFTs can be really expensive and really technically complex to create. So I think actually the evidence and the research we've shown, and I will make sure that my kind of notes are up here, but kind of a lot of artists that have been creating and selling NFTs have actually generated little to no return and have actually sort of, particularly as the NFT market has slumped and the bubble has popped, made losses. And also you have cases where the technical complexity of this means that as an artist, you have to partner with someone that has the technical know-how and perhaps the distribution channels in order to do this. And those partnerships can themselves be quite exploitative at times and rely on someone that has a lot of power over you that can take your work and monetize it. Like I know this from friends of mine, for example, that have signed away artworks on the promise of kind of, 5% of any future NFT sales. And again, so we're starting to see the perpetuation of dynamics, which are, I'm sure, very familiar, sadly, to many in the art world. Similarly, kind of digital marketplaces, they may well open up new audiences, but these aren't unique to Web3 phenomena. And they're basically just broader digitized private markets, which are just as subject to the same kind of exploitation by middlemen and by kind of whales and large speculators as any other form of market, fundamentally. And finally, I think one thing that's really important, which I've touched on, is, we've got to distinguish between the social value of art as a thing and like an art sector and the art sector. So of an individual painting and a sector as a whole. So a lot of what this is basically trying to say is we really value art and we think this is an important thing to have in our society. And so we're trying to find a way of getting me as an individual consumer to channel money into that to support it. Yeah. However, the value that me as a consumer gets out of art, it's the painting I have on my wall or the NFT I have in my wallet, but it's also kind of living in a society that flourishing arts is present in. And I'm just really skeptical of the idea that we can capture enough of that value through more marketization. So, and again, this brings us back. That's fundamentally a public goods problem. Because even if I don't buy any art, if my society has a really nice art scene, I can still benefit from that in many ways. And so again, this is where I think public funding and stuff comes in, but I've reeled off too many there. I'll pause for air.
No, that is a lot of stuff to dig into, but I love it. I love the arguments being made. I guess there's a few things I wanted to touch on here. So one thing you said was most artists that are launching their own NFTs, minting their own NFTs aren't making very much money. Many. Yeah. So, and I agree with that. I think with any pursuit, you're always going to have that sort of, 80-20 sort of split. Doesn't matter what it is. Most people aren't going to make a lot of money. But would you agree that the people that perhaps are making money with NFTs, this is ultimately a new source of income for them above and beyond selling merch, touring, royalties from Spotify, for example, if they're a musician, and perhaps many of the people buying their NFTs are the types of kids that might not actually buy their music or maybe even go to a concert, but they're into that whole Web3 scene. And so in a way, the artist is unlocking a new source of income, a new way to monetize their craft that perhaps previously would not have been open to them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where, as with a lot of stuff in the Web3 space, we've got to distinguish two quite different things. It's kind of, what are the opportunities that are there practically on the ground, given the state of the world now? And what is the potential in this technology to actually kind of do things? And the ability to make money in the world now, like, we can either interpret that as some kind of potential in the technology or as something else. And I think pragmatist that I am, as I say, if you go and join a DAO, or if an artist can actually sell NFTs and make some money and put some food on the table in the current state of the world, then, have at it. I'm not going to throw eggs from the sidelines. But I think the crucial case that I'm trying to make here is that let's not pretend that this is because of some latent potential in the technology to kind of unlock new forms of value or allow us to capture value in new ways that we couldn't otherwise. I mean, fundamentally, to put it quite bluntly, it's because there's a lot of hype and a lot of interest, and we are seeing speculative bubble dynamics, which we've seen, as the NFT market has crashed, as that bubble has started to pop. And as that kind of interest wanes, the potential pragmatically of that as a value stream, I think, will wane as well, because there's not really anything there technologically which is sort of makes it stands out as this unique value proposition. I think that's the claim I'm making.
Yeah. Look, to some degree, I tend to agree with that. I think so much of the interest in NFTs was very much built on cultural forces, was built on hype, was built on FOMO, all that sort of stuff. Now, there are aspects to NFTs that, I suppose technologically, like the immutable sort of aspect to it, and the aspect that, look, I can trade my ownership in this song with someone else, 5 years down the track, I own that, as opposed to, say, downloading a song from iTunes. I don't own that. I just have a license to play it effectively, not even a license. I can just play the song. So that sense, it's different. And that kind of gives people this feeling that perhaps they have a closer relationship with an artist. So, for example, back in the early days of the whole NFT boom, I did spend 0.1 ETH. So back then, maybe about $300. Now a little bit less, on an NFT from a heavy metal band called Avenged Sevenfold. And that NFT would get you access to, say, go backstage when that band is in your town and get access to exclusive songs and things of that sort. And of course, if I don't want the NFT now, the difference between that and a traditional membership where I might pay $100 a year to be part of some fan club is I can now sell that NFT to another Avenged Sevenfold fan and they get those perks. Now, if I was to sell it now, I'd obviously lose money on that. If I was to sell it in the future, the price would go up. But essentially you're arguing, well, that's just, marketization and we don't effectively need another market. It's just speculating on prices of things, which isn't really that revolutionary.
Well, exactly. And also, I think crucially, this uniqueness element that comes with the blockchain technology is another area that I think often we can get really enamored with the technology itself and kind of look at what's it doing here. So, I mean, I heard a really nice example of a musician the other day that's basically selling shares in order to kind of crowdfund the ability to write songs, and then you get kind of partial rights to their royalties. Now, this is kind of, again, comparable. Like, as an artist, I can do all sorts of things within the existing kind of legal paradigm. And again, in the UK, where perhaps it's very easy to set up companies, I don't know, but often do that quite cheaply, or, run a crowdfunder or whatever and say, hey, I'm going to give you this signed rights to XYZ. We don't necessarily need blockchain to that. Now, again, I want to be technology agnostic. It may well be that blockchain might be more preferable for some reason in doing so. But I think that the uniqueness claim is something I really want to push back on here. There are other channels here to do this. And I think the main reason why we've kind of gravitated on blockchain is because of all of this hype and excitement. And actually, plenty of the technologists that we've spoke to have come out and said, this is really not a very efficient technology to do this thing. Append only digital ledgers, super inefficient for pretty much every purpose, and that technologists for ages have bypassed them and used other means. And it's just so happened that we've got very excited. So sure, we can do this on blockchain. We can also do it elsewhere. And let's really look at this in a kind of value neutral way and say, okay, well, where am I weighing up and putting my energy given that reality, rather than buying into this idea that blockchain is giving us something that we can't get elsewhere.
Yeah, that is a good point. I think there are a lot of solutions in the Web3 world that are effectively looking for a problem, or claiming to solve a problem in some kind of novel, technologically driven way, but we don't really need that technologically driven solution. It's like the existing solution works well. Now, crowdfunding, you could argue that perhaps, like you said, there are some downsides with existing mechanisms. Obviously, they are centralized. So, for example, we saw what happened with the trucker convoy in Canada last year, where accounts were frozen. Their GoFundMe page, basically the funds weren't accessible. Whereas with the decentralized mechanism, that would be a lot harder for the government to interfere, particularly if it is held on decentralized wallets and things of that sort. So there are some benefits there as well. But
I mean, picking up on that point, because I think that's a really interesting one here. And I think this is one of the other really things that have been fascinating is when we reduce this down, I think a lot of this does become a matter of philosophy and ideology, because, in one sense, we can view that as a benefit that, we're resistant to government intervention, which, in some cases it may well be. In other cases, we can view that exact same sort of potential mechanism. Now, again, the degree to which that's actually possible. And I think if memory serves, a lot of the centralized exchanges that were kind of have been trading certain coins have been able to be got to by governments, and that kind of capacity in the Web3 space is more limited than sometimes that narrative puts across. But putting that aside, also that is the same thing that can mean that drug cartels and, let's say child pornographers or whoever it is can similarly be using these currencies in quite a censorship resistant way. So again, not to say, and fundamentally it goes down to, okay, well, am I more libertarian leaning and saying, that freedom is kind of worth the price? Or do I trade that off against other values and saying, no, actually the potential for harm and kind of whatever else through that is such that I would be willing to limit that freedom?
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the really interesting points in all this debate, is that kind of values and ideology question.
I think just to touch on that point, so about, drug cartels and, human traffickers and whatnot using Bitcoin and the underlying sort of ledger technology to smuggle money and everything else, and money launder and whatnot. I mean, people said the same thing about the internet back in, the mid 90s. We go back to the start of the 20th century when the automobile more or less started to become commercialized, and you had all sorts of regulations around how fast it could go because the horse-drawn carriage lobby were very vocal. Cars were breaking down. They're very unsafe. Of course, we've seen with the internet, numerous other use cases have come along. It's completely revolutionized how we work, live, and play. The automobile itself revolutionized how we work, live, and play, revolutionized military, logistics, expanded our footprint that we can reach on a daily basis, and, go hiking that in the mountains if you want to, and just improved our quality of life. I mean, numerous other benefits. So I'm not sure, like, the argument that, well, if Mexican cartels use it, that kind of somewhat diminishes the value of the technology. And of course, that's not exactly what you're saying. So chime in if you're...
Absolutely. So again, I think it's very oversimplistic to kind of say, oh, well, these bad things could exist, and therefore we should undermine the technology. But again, I think the point I'm making is the very same sort of capabilities can be used in kind of ways that are both positive and negative, as with all pretty much every technology. And how we weigh those against each other often reduces to kind of where our ideology sits. And, do I think that people should be able to act super freely with, how much am I worried about the state's ability to intervene on my life versus how much am I worried about, perpetuation or
of course. So sorry, go on, mate.
No. Well, exactly that. I'm speaking far too much already. But so I think just really reducing this down to, okay, what is a matter of kind of weighing the technology objectively, and where is it actually a matter of us just viewing this through our ideological lens? And it will always, I think, in my view, not just because I'm a philosopher, reduce down to that matter of ideological bedrock in the end.
Look, I think there is a hell of a lot of ideology in Web3, and I think when one chooses a side and it's based on ideology, then they have a tendency not to entertain opposing viewpoints, and just take on wholesale all of the underlying arguments that a particular side will make, and that doesn't really lend itself to discovering the truth. I see a lot of that within Web3, where people just won't entertain opposing arguments. I think during 2021 or early 22, when the whole Terra Luna shitstorm basically happened, up until that point, anyone on Twitter who was saying, I'm not sure about Terra, was saying anything contrary to, Terra going to the moon, was shouted down by armies of what they called lunatics. And of course, those lunatics mostly went on to lose all of their money, at least a lot of their money that was tied up in Terra Luna. So that is a microcosm of, the dangers of, in that case, not necessarily ideology, but just choosing a side and being all in on that side. But what do you make of, we've kind of touched on NFTs as we've talked about PFPs and, artists and creatives using it to monetize their craft. Maybe we'll touch on the social good stuff as well. But, there are some other use cases that are emerging, like, provenance and fighting, counterfeit goods and things of that sort, where you might be able to scan an NFT on your new Nike sneakers and say that, well, they were actually legit. They were built in this factory and they've gone through one other person before me, and I can see that entire trail, and therefore I could potentially use that technology to fight bootlegging and counterfeiting. What do you make of those types of use cases that perhaps the broader enterprise world is looking into, as opposed to, say, the consumer stuff that's become really popular in the last couple of years?
So I actually dug quite a lot into this. We've got an upcoming report that we supported the US GFOA, Government Finance Officers Association, with, on the kind of potential use cases for blockchain and Web3 for revenue raising. And a lot of these, and I think one of the other ones is kind of tax collection. And I think, I believe it's the Saudis, but don't quote me on that, are kind of looking at this for goods like cigarettes or, you know, similar things like that. And look, I think it's the early days of testing. It may well be implementable. Again, I think from my understanding, there are very little kind of real world battle tested use cases of that type. That's not to say that they're not possible. I think, again, to look at it, let's be technology neutral here. Now, what is the problem we're trying to solve? So let's look, you know, counterfeiting, bootlegging, where does that come from? And then is this technology the best way of us resolving this? And from my perspective, given the evidence that I think actually exists, I don't yet know. So I want to be really clear on that. I think the things that I would say are, again, these technologies are kind of notorious, particularly if you're building like a private blockchain to do this. It can be notoriously expensive. It requires very, very high degrees of technical competency and thus costs. And is that really the optimal route, given kind of opportunity costs of addressing this problem? Again, I don't know in the current state of things, but I think it will be interesting if the kind of the flow of Web3 kind of dies a little, and or like at least, you know, ebbs, should we say?
Yeah.
How many of these projects are really going to be implemented at scale versus that kind of excitement dies back and people realize that you're better off, I don't know, if you're Nike, kind of keeping better track of your factories, for example, and putting more CCTV cameras in for people that might be shuffling stuff out of the back door, which...
Absolutely. And I think, you know, the common theme in this conversation, I suppose, and I'm sure you're willing to make this concession, is that it's still early and many of the potential transformational use cases may not have been developed yet. And, you know, when I look at the accelerator we ran last year, Web3 Startup Accelerator, we got several hundred applications, and dare I say about 98.5% of them were, for lack of a better word, crap, and weren't really solving any big problems. They were just kids that were caught up in the hype cycle. And that sort of percentage, I think you can extrapolate that out across the entire Web3 ecosystem. And I'm sure most people that I know in the Web3 space who, you know, are honest, at least as honest as they can possibly be, and try to be as objective as they can be, they say the same thing. Like, most of the stuff out there is crap. It's just like that less than 1%, 1.5% of stuff that's worth looking into. But I guess at the same token, like, we go back to the mid 90s, you know, when there was 40 odd million people using the internet, it was very much read only. And then in, you know, around 2010, we had that coalescence of faster, cheaper internet. We had mobile, we had cloud, and that just created this boom of, you know, Airbnbs and Uber and Facebook and social media and everything else. And that's really fundamentally different to what we had, say, in the 90s, where I had a one-page GeoCity website, which was terrible. So I guess to that end, what do you say about the fact that, you know, we're only 10 years in, like, since the Bitcoin white paper was published? It's still early.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, as you touched on there, kind of the dot-com bubble burst, and anybody that at that point in history kind of was like, oh, you know, this internet thing has turned out to be a dud, kind of has egg on their face, to put it lightly now. And I'm very, very willing to concede that, you know, as the hype dies down and the kind of the wheat is separated from the chaff, there may well be things that emerge that we're like, hey, you know, this is genuinely very useful. I think the thing that I really want to stress here, and that brings me nicely to the idea that comes up a lot, you know, in my thinking around all of this stuff, is the idea of solutionism, right? So Evgeny Morozov writes the book, I think, Click Here to Save the World, or Click Here to Save Everything, so on and so forth. Yeah. And introduces this concept of solutionism, which is to really boil it down, the kind of boiling down of super complex, sort of messy social problems into these technical things that we can use technology to kind of fix and make more efficient and just make everything run smoothly. And fundamentally, the world doesn't work like that. And I think the worry that I have, particularly in the use cases which are about kind of social change and social transformation, is this kind of creeping solutionism. So a lot of what's come up, you know, as I say, I'm a kind of economist and political scientist and a little bit of a philosopher, but less relevantly by training, is that we are seeing really complex, like, problems of political economy reduced down to kind of like, oh, we can create this market like incentive mechanism on the blockchain, and we can just sort out this thing which has hung over human civilizations for basically forever, as soon as we lived in organized civilizations. And there's a reason for that, right? And that reason is not because we didn't have append-only digital ledgers. So I'm quite open to use cases emerging which may have value, but I think let the idea that we should be funneling vast amounts of resource and energy to transform society in this direction, rather than look at, okay, well, why is it that we haven't yet solved the public goods problem, if it's a thing you can even solve, or why are they really hard to fund? And the answer is not that we don't have a technically good allocation mechanism, or that we can't view things sort of immutably on a blockchain. The answer is that getting people to cough up their money for other people is traditionally really hard, fundamentally, particularly for stuff that they don't see the full impact of. And I think that there's a lot of that creeping about, and that kind of, again, I don't even necessarily put it down to malice on the part of anybody, but particularly, there's another great book. I feel like I'm name dropping now, but in my kind of master's, name
drop away, mate. I'm a big reader, so I'm gonna write all these down and read them all. So drop away.
There's a book called The Anti-Politics Machine by a guy called James Ferguson, right? And it's about kind of an anthropological critique of the development industrial complex. But basically what he ends up saying is there's this refactoring of fundamentally political problems as kind of technical problems that the technocratic development complex can fix, because you have an incentive to view problems in a way that you have the tools to fix. And I think in many ways we see this, and it's not anybody's kind of bad or lying, but for the sake of my job, or even just kind of my way of viewing the world, it makes more sense for me to view it in this way, even if that's kind of divorced from reality. And, in the same way as to the person with a hammer everything looks like a nail, to the person with a computer science degree everything looks like a kind of coding problem.
Of course, I think may have been Daniel Kahneman who called that the law of the instrument bias, which effectively if you have a hammer, everything is a nail. And I've seen this in the corporate innovation world. So I spent many years running a consultancy in that space, and you'd have people who would say get trained up on, say, human-centered design, and that would be their answer for everything. Well, let's run a design thinking sprint. And it's like, well, there's a lot of other ways you can approach this problem, but that was their way, and that was always the solution. It was the be-all, end-all, and it is definitely a trap that people can fall into. And look, social goods, I think, is essentially, I see what you're saying there, and there are platforms out there like Gitcoin, which is trying to solve the social goods problem, but at the same time, it does require that people invest their crypto. And at some point, like when the market's going up and you just, 100x your money on a picture of a bored ape, then you might be more inclined to put X number of, ETH or whatever the case is into something like that. But in the current market, of course, there's going to be a direct correlation with the amount of money going into a platform like Gitcoin, which is not dissimilar to, say, how public goods have traditionally worked as well with governments and whatnot. But one thing you do say as well, you keep pointing to these underlying sort of social, cultural, even say perhaps even biological sort of things that these are the reasons why certain things are so difficult. And you look at DAOs, which have been sold as this big utopian thing. It's going to level the playing field, flat organizations. But when you actually spend some time in DAOs, particularly some of the bigger ones, there are still hierarchies as there were in societies thousands of years ago. There are people who are more influential, who perhaps have more voting rights. Those hierarchies emerge, and even if they have the same number of voting rights as everyone else, there are people in there who are going to be able to influence others a lot more than the person who just joined the DAO today, for example. So totally understand all of that and agree that there are bigger sort of challenges at play here. But maybe we'll sidestep away from that claim, and we've kind of touched on a few of the claims throughout this conversation, which I like. It's been pretty organic. But maybe we'll pull out one, which is that Bitcoin will and should become the new gold standard. And I will just preface this one by saying that not everyone in the crypto space believes this to be true. Like you have big advocates like, say, Mark Cuban, for example, who says that gold is dumb, and that if there is an apocalypse, your gold bars won't matter because someone will just steal them from you. They're not obviously as liquid as something like Bitcoin, and that if you do have gold in its physical form, it's much harder to buy something with it than it is, say, with crypto. But many people do say that Bitcoin is the new gold standard. It is a store of value. So just wanted to preface that. So what is the finding you've made in this space, and why, Theo?
Again, I mean, so I think crucially for the Bitcoin should become the new gold standard, and just really couching the frame in that term. This is one of the ones I'm more confident in personally, that this is sort of abjectly false, to be blunt. And I think that there's a couple of bits of this, right? We should go back to a gold standard. So pegging our currency to gold on the one hand, there's a kind of economic claim, and then Bitcoin is a better job of doing that than gold. And I think it's worth pulling those apart. So I think on the former point of going back to a gold standard, this basically is a kind of the only people that really believe this these days, in kind of, it's one of the few areas that even most orthodox economics agree with people like me, who fundamentally think a lot of orthodox economics is a bit iffy, to say the least. You've just got the kind of the Austrian school, which has kind of long since been debunked as basically kind of arguing for this kind of fixed exchange rate on the basis of gold. And they basically kind of assert, without much evidence, the whole point of Austrian economics was that you kind of derived it from first principles and you didn't really use evidence, that kind of government or central bank intervention is bad and kind of is going to lead to inflation, and that there's also this inherent lack of democracy in this kind of intervention. So we need to guard against that, and the way we do that is by sort of pegging the currency to gold. And I can get into the nitty-gritty of the economics of that. I'm not sure if it's the most interesting for listeners, but fundamentally both of those claims are false. So evidentially, it hasn't really been borne out that more government intervention has led to more financial crises, particularly, or that kind of like particularly kind of worse inflationary crises. I mean, I recognize the irony of saying this in the time of inflationary crisis in much part of the world, but that's not because we've got floating exchange rates and government intervention in the money supply. Really, that's because of a raft of other factors to do with, supply chain shortages, in my case in Britain, massive underinvestment, so on. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't boil down to whether or not we're pegged to gold. Yeah.
Well, would you say sorry, Theo, would you say part of the inflationary sort of effects we're seeing in the market now would be partly due to government intervention? For example, trillions of dollars in stimulus checks that were distributed in the United States during the pandemic probably played a role as well, would you say?
Perhaps to some degree. And again, these are incredibly complex things. But I mean, when we're talking about inflation, there's the broad distinction between cost push and demand pull inflation, right? So like either loads of people are clamoring to buy stuff, and so that pushes prices up because, supply and demand dynamics, I'm sure your listeners are familiar, or things get more expensive, firms put their prices up to protect their profit margins. Fundamentally, we are in a period of time which is characterized almost entirely by the latter. So the stimulus checks argument would, in theory, if we were to play it out, lead to kind of demand push inflation, namely kind of people have more money, so they're going to go buy stuff, so that pushes up sort of inflation. That's not really what we've seen borne out in many developed sort of global north countries, let's say. What we've instead seen is that, we've got the war in Ukraine, is like skyrocketing energy prices. In the case of food and other commodities, we've had crop failures, again, linked to climate change and various other kind of factors. We've had some supply chain problems hung over from COVID, all of which means that stuff is more expensive. Firms don't want to lose out on profit, so they will raise their prices. And actually, not only will they raise their prices because they don't want to cut their profit margins, a survey of firms across the US, I think Paul Krugman writes about this, again, don't quote me if that's not who it is, that a lot of firms are putting up their prices because they know they can get away with it, because people just assume that inflation is this thing. So the argument here that kind of somehow it was the government intervening in the money supply that's predominantly caused inflation, I just don't think is borne out by the evidence.
Yep, no, that's fair. And I think on this claim that Bitcoin should become the new gold standard, one thing you've also highlighted in the report is that one of the reasons you found this to be false is due to the price fluctuations as well. Now, of course, we've seen wild swings in the price of Bitcoin over the past year. At the same time, when we compare Bitcoin to gold, like if we look at price fluctuations for inflation adjusted gold over the past, say, 40 years, like gold, it was about $9,000 per ounce back in like 1980. And of course, for the last 20 years, it's kind of bounced between one and say 2,500. So of course, gold is perhaps more stable, but it's not immune to such price shocks. So just, yeah. So
Yeah,
what do you make of that, given that you've used that as one of your numerous arguments on why Bitcoin should not be the new gold standard?
Absolutely. So again, I think there's the two things here of kind of the state of the world argument and kind of the intrinsic state thing. So Bitcoin may well stabilize. It could well be that it's so embedded in kind of our kind of collective psyche, and we have a narrative around it, that it does kind of stabilize into becoming this new store of value that we all, just through sheer collective belief, kind of it can play this role. I think the thing is with gold, I mean, two things. Firstly, these kind of light instability of gold is over often far longer time horizons. You kind of look at the graphs of gold versus the graph of Bitcoin in kind of a short window, and it's pretty staggering, the difference, right? And I think that's the crucial thing. Like if I'm, let's say I'm in an inflationary crisis or insert other sort of financial shock here, and I want to store value for a few years as an investor, then a couple of years in gold versus a couple of years in Bitcoin looks very, very different. So I think that's a crucial distinction to make, even though gold, you're right, does have some degree of instability. The second thing, and again, this is definitely Paul Krugman in a lecture about this, that gold has some degree of artificial flaw on its value, right? Like we do use gold for stuff, not all of the time, but be it in semiconductors, for example, be it in jewelry, like gold has a kind of market function such that it's always going to have some value because we can use it for stuff as a society. And that puts an artificial flaw on how low the value of gold can go. Because fundamentally, it's not going to drop below the value that I can get for it to actually use it for stuff in the market. Bitcoin doesn't have that. Currently Bitcoin does not have the same kind of I can't go and use my Bitcoins to build something or to heat my house or something, rather than as a medium of exchange and so on and so forth. So this is another way that in which that even though gold might have its level of instability, that is kind of naturally bounded by the fact that we can use it for stuff in our societies. And that is not the same for Bitcoin. So that level of it, if it does stabilize, it's going to be purely as a matter of kind of animal spirits, to use the Keynesian term, of kind of collective belief in this, and kind of just that it becomes our collective psyche that says that gold is going to be worth, or Bitcoin is going to be worth this, not because of any tether to the real productive economy, as in the case of gold.
Yeah. I mean, are there parallels to be made there between, because we have this shared belief in Bitcoin, which in some respects is similar to the nature of money. I have a shared belief that this $10 note in my pocket is worth, a bag of lollies and a couple of chocolate bars, and you have that belief, and therefore you're willing to trade me your bag of lollies and chocolate bar for my $10 note.
Well, I mean, absolutely, except the crucial differential here, and again, we touch on this in the alternative currencies piece, is that our shared belief in money is backed by the state monopoly of violence. If we don't share that belief, and I give you my lolly, and all of a sudden your belief that my lolly is worth your money disappears, I can get a policeman to come. I mean, maybe not across thousands of miles to Melbourne, admittedly. I can get a policeman.
It'd be a very expensive trip for a $10 chocolate bar.
Exactly. But I can get a policeman or a police person to come and knock on your door and grab the money off you. And if you don't do that, they will wrestle you to the ground and put you in handcuffs and put you in jail. And there is a state monopoly of violence here. And again, the state demands taxes in our money. We all have to cough up actual, fiat money of some kind to pay the state. Otherwise, again, they come with their big sticks knocking. And so that means that, again, there is something that underpins this shared belief of ours in money, which is fundamentally absent from cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin.
Absolutely. Well, it is, but at the same time, you're not making the argument that, if I was to send you Bitcoin and you didn't render X services, I could still pursue action in that space. I mean, it is still a somewhat regulated space at the moment, particularly if I have supplemented that transaction with some form of contract, a legal contract, if you will, right?
Yeah, I mean, if we roll cryptocurrencies into our kind of existing sort of social and legal frameworks for other types of money, then absolutely, and we're going to see this, I think, probably with central bank digital currencies and so on and so forth, and they're just going to become another part of the financial infrastructure that we have around us. But then again, they're kind of their USP then disappears, right? they just become fiat money on a computer, which is exactly, I think, almost fundamentally at odds with what a lot of people aspire to from, you know, the narrative of cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, and I mean, some Bitcoin maxis, you know, will effectively say that, but Bitcoin is limited to 21 million coins by, you know, 2100, whatever it is, and therefore it's, you know, deflationary and in a way, which can over time help to make Bitcoin perhaps more stable. And I'm not sure what the price of gold did for the first, you know, 50 years of its existence. It was probably I don't know, maybe it wasn't, quite volatile as well. So what do you make of that argument that, you know, there's only so many Bitcoins that can go into circulation?
Again, I mean, yeah, I'm a cautious soul at heart, and given the kind of these dynamics, I would not want to predict what happens when we kind of hit that cap. I think it's, you know, we can make assertions. I think the one thing that I would say is these deflationary dynamics fundamentally incentivize hoarding, right? Because if we have a intrinsically deflationary asset, let's call it, because it's up for grabs whether Bitcoin is a currency itself. I think we kind of concluded it's not. Then I have an incentive to just sit on that, because it's just going to keep going up in value and going up in value and going up in value. And that means that there's just not market liquidity to enable to kind of do these investments and transactions, which we're going to really want for something like a gold stand-in to facilitate the protection of value in an economy. So, you know, the whole purpose of gold as a store of value is predicated on me being able to actually buy gold if I need to get my value out of, let's say, cash or some, you know, other financial assets which are perhaps more volatile. You know, at least on first principles, if we all just sort of we all realize simultaneously that Bitcoin is deflationary, then we're all just going to try and sit on it, right? I don't want to sell you my Bitcoin if you need it, because actually if I could just wait another few months, then I could sell it for more. But then that logic continues in perpetuity. So I think these very deflationary dynamics which are pointed to also can lead to some quite dysfunctional economic behavior for the purposes that we are going to be trying to use this as a tool to solve.
Yeah, and no, well argued. And you know, I think for every argument to the for Bitcoin, there are well and truly arguments against it. And you know, it's a bit of a squeeze ball. Yes, it's a deflationary currency, but when you do that, and there's only so many that, you know, Bitcoins that are going to go into circulation, well, then you have the hoarding incentive, and you don't have money going into circulation and whatnot, and that has obviously downstream adverse consequences as well. So on Bitcoin and gold, I mean, we are seeing that in emerging economies, particularly in Southeast Asia, parts of Latin America, Argentina, people are buying up Bitcoin because they see it as a hedge against what are hyperinflationary currencies in their local countries. Is this a product of just that shared belief, or is this some greater sort of underlying value that you see here, which is prompting people in emerging economies to basically buy up Bitcoin and alternative digital currencies?
Yeah, and I think this was actually one of the biggest qualifications that I made to our analysis. I think with the piece on remittances and exchange services, that, as you say, that this just is happening. I mean, I read a lot of really interesting stuff about the Ukraine, because there's been much made of the kind of crypto-based donations to Ukraine, but actually crypto currencies and tokens were used far more prominently even prior to the war, because, as you say, their currency was so inflationary and so fundamentally unstable. So I think these are serving a purpose here in some sense, and again, pragmatically in the state of the world as it is today. But again, I really kind of want to, and you know, I do not want to sit here as someone, you know, in the global north in a position of financial privilege and stability, and you know, sure, the UK by many standards is kind of falling apart at the seams at the moment, and our currency is not doing too great itself, but it's a damn sight better than most places. And so I don't think it's really for me to say like, oh, you know, you should get rid of this, because I don't think it's a particularly good idea. However, I think all of that said, pragmatically, while I can see the value in it as a kind of tool for the moment, it's fundamentally a sticking plaster on a missing limb. You know, I mean, like we look at the global international economic order that we have, wherein people can be in situations where the money that they hold can't buy them basic amenities to live. Like that is absolutely staggering. given the levels of global, I mean, I heard dreadful reports of debt vultures in Pakistan, for example, who've bought up a load of debt and are fundamentally resisting debt relief for these countries because they can make money off this. And this is the global economy that we live in. And so the fact that the response to that is, oh, well, we're just going to kind of sidestep again this like really messy question of, be it kind of trade policy or international debt policy or kind of international lending, and say our solution is going to be to just not engage with that and just jettison ourselves into an alternative digital economy. I think it serves a purpose in alleviating immediate suffering, but it really diverts us from what is going severely wrong in the global economy as it stands. And that is a question of like unjust extraction, as far as I'm concerned, that is not going to be resolved by another digital currency being taken up by the global south.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, there is, and as you say, value to this to people in, say, Argentina in the moment, given the circumstances they find themselves in. However, that is not a long-term solution. I mean, people in Web3, particularly diehards and crypto diehards and whatnot, will say, well, we need to decouple from traditional institutions. But that is a nice thing to say, but it is a very complex matter, particularly if you want to be in the world and trade goods and do all these things that are fundamental to economic prosperity over time. It's not that easy to decouple completely from existing systems. And there are people in, say, DeFi and platforms out there like Aave and protocols and whatnot that say, well, we've already got everything. Look, we've got people using our currency. It's decoupled. It's decentralized. You can buy stuff with it. You can do all this stuff. But is it scalable? If I look at the number of transactions taking place in this sphere, it's in the several thousand a day. I mean, compared to the global traditional financial ecosystem where it's in the trillions. So it's like, yes, but no.
Exactly. It's paltry, and even with kind of the trajectories of growth. And again, the state and its big stick is going to be coming knocking for its taxes. And while you are still embedded in this system and you are still embedded in a real world economy, the idea of total decoupling, I think, is fundamentally fantastical. And I am open to the idea of some kind of complementary financial systems. I've been quite interested in the idea of mutual credit networks and so on and so forth. However, I think to say that we can kind of extricate ourselves from global capitalism, A, or B, that we can fix the ills of global capitalism as it stands via technological means, B, is not only a fantasy, but it can be a really, to my mind, this is one of the times where I will go out on a limb and be quite strong here, a dangerous one, because it's distracting us from the root causes of the rot that we are facing, which is fundamentally driving many societies and our planet into the ground.
Yeah, exactly. I could not agree more. And I think one final place I wanted to touch on before we wrap up, or almost out of time, is you've presented a massive body of work here. Congratulations on all the work you've done in this space. I imagine there was a process after you came to your conclusions, some kind of peer review process that you guys embarked upon. What did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, so we've been very lucky in that we've collected along the way a number of very knowledgeable friends in this space. And I think from across the aisle, although I will sort of hold my hands up and say more on the skeptical side than the kind of deeply embedded side. So we've been very lucky to be able to have friends take a look at this, and also that the entire creation of this guide has to some degree been a collaborative enterprise. So we've done a load of deep dive conversations with a range of actors, including those very much in the crypto space. We had a great conversation with KlimaDAO, for example, and Haifa and people like that, which then gave us content that fed into this. So as well as kind of having people look at the outputs, the very sort of creation process itself has been quite participatory. And one of the things that we really like about this is that the entire site is set up as a contributable wiki. So, I would really encourage people, if you're taking a look and you disagree with something, or you spot an error, you can kind of go via GitHub and kind of make a pull request and add to this, or even add your own content. So we really don't want to kind of be the owners and arbiters of this. We want to put this out there and say, let's have a discussion, let's have a debate. Do you disagree with this? If so, why? I've tried to set this out in kind of really clear premise, conclusion for people, hopefully to prod at and poke holes in and make suggestions as to where it can be sort of revised or so on. So it's been quite collaborative and open from the start, and we really hope that goes on as we now put it out there.
Yeah, fantastic. Absolutely love that approach, and encourage people to take a similar approach in their own lives when they hold certain beliefs to be true. Just stress test them, put them out there, get people who disagree to poke holes in them, and they're not necessarily poking holes in you and your being, they're just poking holes in your argument, and maybe they have a point. So well done on the report. If people want to read the report, they can head over to web3.lifeitself.org. If they want to connect with yourself, Theo, where is the best place to do that?
Probably LinkedIn. I'm not really on much social networks, I must admit. So just Theo Cox on LinkedIn. My email is theo@lifeitself.org if you want to drop me a line, and I'm always really happy to chat to people.
Fantastic. Well, we'll add some of those links to the show notes for our listeners. Theo, thank you so much for your time today, and all the best with your work.
Thanks so much, Steve. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you.